Friday, time for your history briefing. So you notice I'm not wearing a Hawaiian shirt today. It's okay. I'm making up for it with a Hawaiian tie. Got important meetings today, so couldn't go with the shirt, even though it's fall break. So today we're going to talk about James Sidney Rollins. And so we are outside of Rollins House. That's what the big plaque over the door back there says, at Wright Quadrangle. So a lot of people think that Wright Quad is just Wright Quad, but actually has 17 houses within it, and all the houses are named after early alumni, faculty, or Board of Trustees members. James Sidney Rollins is one of those. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about him today. So in the 1820s, he was a student at Washington College under Andrew Wiley, and when Andrew Wiley became president of IU, he came to IU with Wiley. So kind of like the first transfer student. There were actually a number of students from Washington College that came with Wiley, so he wasn't the only one. But in 1830, he was in the first graduating class from IU, which makes him one of those early alumni. He then went out west to Missouri, lived in Missouri, owned property there, got involved in the Black Hawk War, rose to the rank of major in the Black Hawk War, and then eventually got elected to Congress from Missouri. And he spent a lot of time in Missouri doing Missouri politics and involved with things that were going on there. And so I did bring some notes for today because it gets a little complicated there. By the outbreak of the Civil War, he was elected to the House of Representatives and was serving in Congress for the United States. And they actually tried to appoint him a colonel in the Union Army, and he decided that he would have more of an impact by remaining in the legislature during the war, which is probably true in some ways. So he went on during the war to help support and advocate for the Morrill Land Grant Act. The Land Grant Act would go on to create the land grant schools, places like Purdue and Auburn and schools like that, but also places like the University of Missouri, which he went on to shepherd and found and is known as the founding father of the University of Missouri. So they have a lot of Rollins history at the University of Missouri, much more than we have here, but he did have that role and is known for that. He also was an advocate for the Transcontinental Railroad and got the Transcontinental Railroad built. But he's also a really complicated guy, and this is the part I like about history, where things get messy, and this is part of what makes him one of the interesting people to learn about or read about. So he was also a slave owner and responsible for passing the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives. So think about those two for a second, and let me break it down for you and tell you a little bit about how that came to be. So he was a slave owner during the war, and he was a border state conservative during the war. He was pro-Union, wanted to keep the Union together, didn't agree with the Confederacy, and kept Missouri in the Union throughout the war, but was also a slave owner. And by about 1864, you start seeing his tone change about owning slaves. And so you start seeing him say things like, "Does any man in this house believe that the institution of African slavery will survive this rebellion? If there is such a man, I choose to differ with him." And so he really starts to see that slavery is going to end with the Civil War one way or another. And then he begins saying things from the floor of the House like, "I am gratified that I am not too obstinate to change." And he's sort of starting to change his mind and his attitude about slavery. It's not to say a lot of the things he said by today's standards aren't really pretty racist, but they for the time period, his mindset and his change is really interesting to watch. And by January of 1865, Missouri outlaws slavery. And so suddenly, he no longer owns slaves. His slaves have been freed back in Missouri. And he gives a speech from the floor of the House where he says, "An anti-slavery man in sentiment, and yet heretofore a large owner of slaves myself. Not now, however. I am no longer the owner of a slave, and I thank God for it. If the giving up of my slaves without complaint shall be a contribution upon my part to promote the public good, to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to restore peace and preserve this Union, if I had owned 1,000 slaves, they would most cheerfully have been given up. I say with all my heart, let them go, but let them not go without a sense of feeling and a proper regard on my part for the future of themselves and their offspring. May the blessing of God rest upon them." So he says this from the floor of the House. Pretty soon thereafter, the 13th Amendment has already failed twice in the House. So Abraham Lincoln comes to Rollins and says, "Hey, you're a conservative border state guy. I need your votes. I need you to help me get this 13th Amendment through." And Rollins agrees to do it. And so Rollins, by the end of the month, manages to get the votes to swing that way to get the 13th Amendment passed in the House by 2 votes. 2 votes. That was all it passed by in the House. Later on, Lincoln thanks him, gives him credit for having gotten it passed through the House, which was the biggest hurdle that they had in getting the 13th Amendment passed legislatively, and he was the one that kind of pushed it through. So there's this weird sort of complicating thing about his history and how his mindset changed, and there's great books about how his mindset changed and how things during that time happened in his life and his world. They're really fascinating to read. I've read several of them, and if you ever want to read one, give me a holler, let me know. I'll point you to a couple of them. We have them right here in the IU library. But Rollins is a really fascinating person to kind of hear about and learn about, this little bit of history that most people have no idea why we have a Rollins House on campus, or why a lot of things are named for folks. And this is why I think it's important that we do this sort of public history work and let people know who things are named after and why. So that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.